Greetings homunculi and welcome to Codex Compliant, the series where we take a look at the various codices, magazines and general stuff Games Workshop has put out over the years.
Today we take a look at the 1998 Codex Dark Eldar. The cruel, twisted Dark Eldar are piratical raiders who strike without warning, killing or enslaving all who stand in their way.
This is a very special codex, not only because it's the first Dark Eldar codex, but because it's the first one I ever owned, hence why it's in less than stellar condition. This is another one that had a second edition released later with minor changes, but we're looking at the original edition because that's just the one what this is.
So, the Dark Eldar, or Drukhari as they're also now known, are the other side of the Eldar. Less aloof and restrained, and more kill you, skin you, and wear that skin as a mask kind of people. And if you're very, very lucky, they'll do it in that order.
I remember going into a Games Workshop back when they were still the new hot thing and having the salesman say something like, "You see, the difference between the Eldar and the Dark Eldar is that the Eldar would just kill you, but the Dark Eldar would chop your hands off and wear them as a necklace first." Which as a 12-year-old sounded frankly amazing, and they became my very first 40k army. Although I imagine that conversation was slightly more worrying to my mum, who I'm pretty sure was with me.
This being the first Codex Dark Eldar, it had to establish everything about them. A tough job, since codices from early 3rd edition were pretty short compared to, well, every other era. I mean, sure, Eldar was shown to be piratical in earlier editions, and there was that Dark Elf trooper model from way back, but none of those were really capital D Dark Eldar. However, the brief introduction to them in here does do a very accurate job of describing them. They are devious, vain, and totally self-serving, with no respect for any living creature, not even themselves. The Dark Eldar are not nice. Not nice at all. Well, I mean, it's not wrong.
Since it's their first appearance, the roster is a little limited compared to today, but every unit in here is still around, even if they look quite a bit different, like the Talos, or are categorised differently, like Scourges who were originally heavy support, or just became Illidan Stormrage, like Mandrakes did. There's also the Chimera, then known as Warp Beasts. The modern models, shown here, look great, but the old ones, less so. This one's my favourite. There's also this artwork of one that looks less like a life and death battle and more like the Marine is trying, and failing, to train a misbehaving puppy. A very ugly, skinless puppy.
It might also surprise you to know, considering how the Dark Eldar are inescapably linked to them, that Slaanesh is only mentioned once in this entire book. And even then the name Slaanesh isn't actually used. This little section on page 42 mentions there's some relationship between the Dark Eldar and the one who thirsts that is probably what causes them to be so murderous. But it's impossible to say what that link is exactly. You know, unless you read it in the next codex.
It's also interesting how they work the Dark Eldar's piratical nature into their special rules. The Piratical Raiders special rule states that in any mission where there's an attacker and a defender, the Dark Eldar must always be the attacker, since, you know, they're raiders, it's just what they do. Also, due to the capturing prisoners special rule, when a Dark Eldar squad forces a unit to fall back from close combat, they can roll to capture enemy models. These will be put to one side and give you victory points, and to torment your opponent like, you know those characters you've written elaborate backstories for? Well, they didn't die gloriously in battle. My space elves are taking them back home and, well, I'm gonna be honest, they're gonna die slow.
This facet of their nature is also referenced in the scenario featured in the Codex, Slave Raid, in which the Dark Eldar player must attack a base camp, capture prisoners, and escape all before the defender's reserves arrive. Actually, speaking of the Dark Eldar's more grim proclivities, something we find endlessly entertaining are the super edgy quotes spread throughout this book. Much like how an Imperial Codex will have quotes like, "We are the Astartes," and "The Emperor is, well, good," or whatever, in here you get something a little bit more, well...
You are doomed! Doomed, I tell you! For tonight, we will feast on your very souls. Fear the shadows. Despise the night. There are horrors that no man can face and live. Fetch me another plaything. This one seems to have broken. They are not your worst nightmare. They are your every nightmare.
Hey, it was the 90s, look, between things like Mortal Kombat and Spawn, it was just generally a pretty edgy time, and I can't really blame Jervis and Gav for going that way, you know?
Death is my meat, terror my wine.
Where is that coming from?
Oh, and yes, this codex was written by Jervis Johnson and Gavin Thorpe, which leads us to the official codex-compliant drinking game. The rules are very simple. Every time you see Gav Thorpe's name appear in an episode, take a shot. Here's what you should be up to so far.
And yeah, we know that there's been a lot of other authors that have been very involved with 40k. It's just that whenever we do research for one of these videos, Gav's name just keeps coming up over and over again.
He's one prolific dude. Given what we know of the Dark Eldar, their war gear section in here is suitably grim. A few examples are the Terrafex, a wrist-mounted grenade launcher whose Wraithbone grenades produce nightmarish psychically induced visions.
The Crucible of Malediction, what seems to be a lament configuration containing the souls of tortured psykers that, once per game, could be used to instantly kill a psyker. Seen here modelled by the old Urian model. Ain't he pretty?
And gruesome talismans, which are just the random fingers, ears, testicles, etc. taken from their enemies that the Dark Eldar affix about their person, as is their fashion. This freaks out their opponents so much that models with this gear count as 2 models when working out which side outnumbers the other in close combat, and it should be noted it works on demons too, so, like, even demonettes see this and are like, can you tone this down a bit?
There's also this 2-page spread written in-universe looking at various Dark Eldar weaponry, and these things are always fun. I mean, I don't know what a Magneto Impulse Directional Spine is exactly, but knowing that that's what this bit is somehow makes the guns feel a little bit more plausible, you know?
As ever, this book contains a host of special characters. There's Vect on his Days of Destruction, Cruella the Vile with her spiky hands that were far less spiky when the model actually came out, as well as Lilith Hesperax, Drazar, Urian Rakarth, and finally, the Mandrake champion, Decapitator. I mean, they do say his Eldar name in here too, which they use in his later appearances, but his stats are labelled as Decapitator here, so that's his name. It's also what he calls his weapon, which I imagine gets confusing.
So that was Codex Dark Eldar. The only thing really left to mention about it is that this codex lasted for a really long time. It would take until 2010, a whole 12 years and 2 editions later before they get an update, if you don't count the 2nd edition printing, which we don't.
This meant that the very first codex I ever owned was actually still the current one when I got back into the game like a decade later. And not many codex can say that.
Ice without life, maggots-ridden corpses, mountains of skulls. These are a few of my favourite things.
Okay, we really have to do something about that.